We shall commence this module by discussing what is occupation and occupational structure. Occupation stands for trade or profession. It signifies the nature and magnitude of economic progress of a country. Related to agriculture, industry and services, occupations depend on the degree of economic development and sophistication of the country. Occupational structure determines many aspects of population in an area. The characteristics of occupation of the population are reflected in the working force, dependency load, employment and unemployment. Not only that, it is also a key component and manifestation of population composition and give a proper illustration of ratio between the working and the non-working population in an area or in a country. Occupational structure is a major determinant in the socio-economic development of an area. The area-wise distribution of working, non-working population has been studied on the basis of data provided by the Census of India. This relevant data has its own utility and role in policy decision. The proportion of workers engaged in various occupations highlights the economic and cultural surfaces of the society. In India, especially the cultural tie-ups have strong bearing on man's livelihood. Further, economic power of a country depends largely on the proportion in which the productive workers are carefully engaged in various economic activities. Since long, man in the distant past has been pursuing economic activities in one form or the other, as certain requirements of human life are so universal and so uniform that they must be fully met and admit no incomplete or intermittent satisfaction. At first, occupational development very much coexisted with economic development. There is indeed a close and direct relationship between the development of an economy and the occupational structure, and the economic progress is generally associated with the certain necessary and predictable changes in occupational structure. Hence, any change in the occupational structure may be the cause of changes in the economic growth. In other words, the growth and prosperity of a region are largely dependent on the size of working population. Not only economic development, but occupational structure and composition also throw enough light on the social inequality of the country or an area. In the social respect, prestige or status belonging to an individual because of his occupation in the society has changed from one period to another with varying degrees. Even the modern society practices the procedure of allocating high prestige value to certain occupations, which is indeed of little social utility and reflects the influences of the traditional forces of the past. However, the occupation itself forms an important constituent of the social history, but today one can know that the occupational structure of a society is the product of a number of intimately related factors such as agricultural development, industrialization and civilization. Utility of primary resources are one on a commercial scale generates diversification of occupational structure, and in relation to that, if the agriculture remained at subsistence level, there is not much diversification of occupations. The diversification process gets further varied from industrialization because it generates a plethora of jobs. Succeeding in science and technology introduces an element of specialization in the occupational composition by creating highly specialized type of jobs. These developments together help in the creation of a new urban culture which is more service oriented. It changes and improves the occupational structure considerably. The importance of occupational distribution of population of an area belongs to the fact that it displays the socio-economic characteristics of the people living in that particular region. Hence, it is one of the important measures of socio-economic development of the country. In modern India, together with industrialization, modernization and globalization, the choice of choosing one's occupation or job and work culture has changed tremendously. It has become individual based instead of being forced to take up interest in traditional jobs. Modern India has given freedom to everyone to choose any profession which one may like. In the modern world, besides being a facilitator, the government and the biggest employer, the government is expected to create more employment opportunities for the people, whether job market requires employing more people or not. And the truth is that still a large number of people remain unemployed. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the increasing trend of the unemployed strength in India, understand the positive relation of unemployment with population growth in India, understand the need of the country to use sustainable development techniques and to curb the population growth, know about the government role plays in the economy of 1.2 billion people and the hardships in attaining the planned goals, understand agriculture, the main occupation and the problem which needs to be addressed. Let us now know the history and background of employment pattern. Employment pattern in ancient and medieval India was a lot different. In ancient and medieval India, there was work, employment, dignity and honor for all. There was no shortage of employment opportunities for person able and willing to work. People were usually busy in their own traditional occupations. Instead of blaming others for their unemployment, the system held responsible evils considered like adharma means immoral behavior, alasya means laziness and agyan means ignorance for unemployment and all evils like exploitation, poverty and helplessness that give rise unemployment automatically. There was differentiation by the traditional system of occupation between various occupations which was dependent on attitude and aptitude of people. But the main feature of traditional system was that it encouraged the interdependence in social matters. Economic growth illustrates a relative shift in the structure of labor away from agriculture towards industries and services. This has not only happened to the primary product producers like Great Britain, where the share of agriculture has declined to less than 4%, but also to specialized primary producers like Australia, Denmark and New Zealand, where the agriculture share has been declined to 10 or 15%. Simon Kuznets, who analyzed and compared the long-term trends in the structure of the labor force to 25 countries for which information is available, finds India to be the only case of a virtually unchanged employment structure. The Indian experience is indeed an important one in the history of economic development, worthy of careful, detailed examination. Reliable information on the structure of the workforce is available for the 20th century from the population census. Census data also exist for 1871-72, 1881 and 1891, but the 1871-72 data, which relates to British India and native states, is clearly unreliable, as the adult male workers exceed the adult male population by about 4.6 million. However, the 1891 data relates to the occupations of the entire population and cannot therefore be compared with the 20th century estimates, which generally relates to the labor force. The 1881 evidence can be used provided its limitations are realized. The 1881 estimates are in relation to males and a territory which is inclusive of Ajmer, Bengal, Bihar, Bombay, Central Provinces, Madras, Northwest Provinces, Punjab, Baroda, Central India, Mysore and Travancore. A further shortcome is that the proportion of general labor, that is unspecified workers, is as high as 8.3% of the task force. Comparisons is made between the 1881 estimates with similar estimates for 1911, a fairly normal year. The economic system back then as a whole had led the society to have more production, economic efficiency and specialization in various areas of activities like spinning, weaving, pottery making, bead making, seal making, terracotta, handicrafts, bricklaying and metal work. Moving on to discuss the occupational structure in India. Occupation as a term is indefinite as to both meaning and scope. It is indeed inclusive of a varying intellectual content and emotional association. All modern languages have a number of synonyms of it, and the diversity of their meanings indicates as to how much the specific content of this term has shifted through historical period. Thus, the meaning of occupation has undergone continuous changes from its distant past. Hence, its content can be fixed only for a short period of time. An occupation of an individual comprises of his trade, profession, type of work. Work is used in a special sense and therefore stress should be made to understand it correctly. Work may be defined as participation in any economically productive activity. This participation can be physical or mental in nature. Work not only involves actual work but also effective supervision and direction of work. India is indeed the land of diversity. For detailed explanation, the occupation activities are divided into three. First, primary sector. Primary activities in India are inclusive of agriculture, animal husbandry, collecting wood or other forest products, fisheries and mining activities for raw material. About 51.2% of the workforce of India is associated with farming and allied occupation. Second, secondary sector. Secondary activities include the manufacturing industry, building and construction work, and other similar activities that create finished products. About 14% of the workforce is involved in this sector, and this sector contributes 28% of the GDP. Third, tertiary sector. Tertiary activities include transport, communications, commerce, administration, and other services. 23% of people are involved in tertiary occupations. This is the fastest growing sector with a growth rate of 7.5% and contributes 55% to the GDP. Health of the population is a major factor affecting the development process of the country. Due to the efforts of government, India's death rate has declined from 25 per 1000 population in 1951 to 7.4 per 1000 in 2012, and the life expectancy at birth has increased to 66.21 years in 2012. The per capita calorie consumption is much below the recommended levels, and malnutrition afflicts a large percentage of our population. To control and stabilize the growth of population, Government of India initiated the National Family Planning Program in 1952. The program was to promote responsible and planned parenthood on a voluntary basis. Now, we will understand the occupational structure and economic development. The National Population Policy, popularly known as NPP, was adopted in the year 2000, and it provides a policy framework to address the issues of child survival, maternal health and contraception. NPP 2000 aims at imparting free and compulsory school education up to 14 years of age, reducing infant mortality rate to below 30 per 1000 live births, immunizing children against preventable diseases, promoting delayed marriages for girls, and making family welfare a people-centered program. A close relationship between occupational structure and the economic development of the country has been observed. High level of economic development is generally correspond to a relative increase in the employment away from the agricultural sector and the higher level of population engaged in the tertiary sector. Simply saying, the economic progress leads to the steady shift of employment and investment from primary activities to secondary and then to the tertiary activities. The changing profile of the occupational structure during 1972-73 to 2004 and 5 with its data revealed that the share of workforce deployed in agriculture went down from 74% in 1972-73 to about 61% in 2001 and 2, that further dropped to 52.5% in 2011 and 12. The share of employment in the industry has gone up from 11.2% to 14%, which had earlier dropped to 12.2% in 2004 and 5. The service sector has grown from 14.6% to approximately 23% during the same period. It may also be kept in mind that the portion of agriculture in total GDP has dropped tremendously, but the corresponding dip in the employment share has not taken place in India in the primary sector. Agriculture's share of GDP has nearly halved in the past 2 decades, and its share of the workforce has fallen much more slowly. The number of people working towards agriculture are now 2.7 times the share of the GDP. The manufacturing sector's share of GDP has hardly seen any increase in the last 2 decades. Similarly, the share of manufacturing sector in employment has risen only slightly by 1.5%. Indeed, its share of employment has hardly changed over the last century. The total shift in GDP from occupational structure has overdrawn manufacturing. Those figures only indicate that the process of industrialization has failed to absorb the excess labor in the agriculture. Also, the manufacturing sector in India comprises of only a small number of medium and large industries in which value added is high, whereas very large number of small industries in which value addition is low. The share of the service sector in GDP has grown dramatically by 14.4%, and this fast growth resembles the share of the services sector in the developed economy. However, the share of services in employment has only inched up 7.2 percentages over the same period. The growth in services share of GDP and the growth in its share of employment should not be confused with and are two separate processes. This sector is marked by an extreme dual approach on the one hand and low income high employment segment, which contributes most of the growth in the sector's employment. On the other hand, a high income low employment sector which supplies most of the growth in the sector's income. For example, the information technology, ITES, financial and real estate services and the media sectors. The most unique characteristic of the occupational structure in India, the overwhelming majority of workforce remains in the unorganized sector. As a matter of fact, the organized sector is able to enforce upon the unorganized sector as a method of exploiting workers. According to reports, since the 1990s, within the organized sector, the number of organized workers, that is those who enjoy legal rights such as security of employment, minimum wages and sick leave, has fallen, and that of unorganized workers has grown during 1999 to 2005. The aim of these changes is to reduce the organized sector's wage bills and increase their profits. The trend followed by the employers is that they have adopted a policy of replacing permanent staff with temporary workers and hence have created conditions that generate a large unorganized pool of workers. Considering the fact that the unorganized sector and within this the household sector has continued to employ the bulk of the non-agricultural workforce, yet has failed to show improvements in the productivity levels. So, the employment growth in the unorganized sector is deceptive and it is basically a form of underemployment. The relationship between the agriculture and the manufacturing sector has been declining, and the tertiary sector has emerged significantly even before the economy became highly industrialized. This is in sharp contrast to the development experience visualized in the developed countries. However, there are certain features that we need to shed light on. First, agriculture, the occupation. Agriculture is the main occupation in India. 52% of population is engaged in agriculture as against 71% in 1901. This has given rise to uncontrolled unemployment, and therefore it has a very small chance of reducing the burden of population on agriculture. Second, slower rate of development of industries. 17% of population depends on manufacturing industries in India. In USA, 32%, in England, 42%, and in Japan, 39% people are engaged in manufacturing or in the secondary sector. Third, unbalanced economy. Indian economy is highly unbalanced. All production activities are not equal. Too much dependence on agriculture is a symptom of economic backwardness. Fourth, low earning rate. Per capita income and standard of living of the people in India is low. It is because agriculture yields less income than trade. Fifth, existence of small villages. Dominance of agriculture proves that most of the people in India must be living in small villages, and number of people living in towns and cities must be very small. India has 76% of its population living in rural areas and 24% in the urban areas. Sixth, poor agriculture. Approximately 60% of the population practices agriculture, yet we import food grains from other countries. It clearly shows that our agriculture is very backward. Whereas in America, 2% of population is engaged in agriculture, which exports the surplus of food to other countries. It shows that agriculture sector should be developed. Seventh, continuous rise in agriculture laborers. The number of agricultural laborers has been rising during the period of planning, displaying the fact that the number of wage earners is increasing in agricultural sector. Eighth, very slow development of tertiary sector. Tertiary sector, which includes services, banking, communication and transport, is not much developed in India. 20.5% of population is engaged in tertiary activities as against 66% in England and 49% in Japan. Analyzing and concluding the discussion about the occupational structure. Analysis of reports have shown that occupational distribution of India's workforce shows the backwardness of the economy. From the year 1901 to 1970, there was no change in the occupational pattern, especially in the primary sector, agriculture. In 1901, 71.7% of the labor force was engaged in the primary sector. In 1971, almost the same proportion, that is 72.2% of the labor force was in agriculture. Only in 1981, there has been a small decrease in the proportion of workforce engaged in agriculture. In 1991, 66.8% of the labor force was employed in agriculture. A recent estimate shows that 56.7% of our labor forces are employed in agriculture. Another feature of the occupational structure in the country is the constant graph in the ratio of labor force employed in the secondary and tertiary sector. 27.9% of the labor force was employed in the secondary and tertiary sector till 1971. In 1951, 10.7% was engaged in the industrial sector, which slightly increased to 12.7% in 1991. NSS estimate shows that in 1999-2000, 17.5% was engaged in secondary sector. In the second plan, huge investment was made to industrialize the economy, and this put small effect on the occupational structure of the country. Analyzing the rate of the labor employment in tertiary sector, it was found that 17.2% were engaged in this sector in 1951 during the period of first 6 plan, that is 30 years. The employment rate remains unchanged. In 1981, 17.7% were employed in tertiary sector. Only in 1991, this ratio had gone up to 20.5%, and in 1990-2000, it went up to 25.8%. After the satisfaction of the basic needs, that is food, clothing and shelter, which directly comes from agriculture and industry, people demanded various kinds of services like health, education, travel, transport, banking and insurance. With the development of a large middle class in India, the share of service sector to the GDP and the ratio of workforce engaged in tertiary sector was supposed to increase. We can say that there is no visible shift in the labor force from the primary to the secondary and to the tertiary sectors in our country during the 20th century. If we accept this hypothesis that economic development of a country is associated by a shift of the working population from the primary to the secondary and then to the tertiary sector, then it indicates that the economic progress is not favorable in India. With time passing, India needs a centered focus with great leadership. Let us now summarize what we have discussed in this module. Occupational structure is a major determinant in the socio-economic development of an area. The main feature of traditional system was that it encouraged interdependence in social matters. Occupational activities are divided into primary, secondary and tertiary sector. High level of economic development is generally corresponds to a relative increase in employment away from the agriculture sector and the higher level of the population engaged in the tertiary sector. Features needed to be shed light upon are agriculture, the occupation, slower rate of development of industries, unbalanced economy, lower earning rate, existence of small villages.